webinar, I understand. This is the second part of KHAS University lectures on global political economy, and we are starting with Marc Lavoie. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Yes.
For those of us who are in the economics business, if you like, he's so well known that he doesn't need any introduction. However, we have some guests who are not economists, so let me briefly try to introduce Marc. First of all, he was a member of the national fencing team of Canada when he started his career as an athlete, and then became an economist, as I understand, and attended the Olympics a few times. He is in the Hall of Fame of athletes in Canada, as I understand. But more importantly, he is one of the major contributors of post-Keynesian economics, as we know it. Very influential contributor, I would say. Many papers, I don't know how many, I cannot claim I saw all of them, but had a chance to read a few. One of his books with Godley is always close to me, and I open and read parts of it every now and then. And he's going to talk to us today as the master of this business, one of the masters of this business, on the controversies about causes of post-COVID inflation in North America. So this stage is yours, Marc. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to diffuse my ideas on this very difficult subject, which is inflation today. The first thing I want to say is that there's a controversy among economists, but also among heterodox economists about what are the causes or the present causes of this inflation. Now, I will focus on Canada because this is the country that I know. Sometimes I will refer to the United States, but I will not be talking about problems such as those that you have in Turkey with high inflation. So, I'm still dealing here with moderate inflation. Also, I will be using figures from various sources without, acknowledging from where they come, just to go a bit faster. Okay, so what are the causes of current inflation? Well, one could argue that there is data that provides support for any of these explanations, whether it's excess money supply, excess government expenditures, excess growth in wages, the supply chains problem, the rising price of oil, the war in Ukraine. Inflation expectations is perhaps the only one that has no support. And finally, my focus will be on profit margins because this is where most of the controversy is about among heterodox economists. Well, this is a picture of the rate of inflation, CPI inflation in Canada. As you can see, the target is the horizontal line at 2%. It went as high as 8%. Now it's around 6%. It's the same in the other countries, whether it's United States, United Kingdom, or the Euro area. You can see there's a common movement in CPI inflation. Okay, so what are these possible causes of COVID inflation? The first one, of course, is, the money supply. And so right now we have a kind of return to monetarism. So inflation would be caused by an excess creation of money. You can see this in newspapers quite a lot. Even now, some people are blaming MMT for the high current inflation rates, because the understanding of MMT in the social media, a wrong understanding, I would say, is that government expenditures can all be financed by printing press. So you can see in italics this statement found in April 2022, but you can find it in many other places, saying there was a big increase in the monetary base, which was an experiment linked to modern monetary theory. And now the verdict is in, MMT would be the cause of inflation. What do we see? Well, yes, it is true that there's been a huge increase in the balance sheet of many central banks, including the one in Canada. You can see that this happened. I mean, if we look now at bank reserves, you can see that in February 2020, there was virtually zero. I mean, there was only $250 million worth of reserves in the system. And then it moved to as high as 327 billion. So it was 1,000 times bigger. The amount of reserves in the system was 1,000 times bigger than it was initially. So, you know, monetarists would say that's the cause of inflation. Another reason they might say so is looking at the money supply. If you look at M2, you can see that there's been an increase of about 10% per year for 3 years since the start of the COVID. And so again, you know, people would say, well, it takes some time for the rise in the money supply to have an impact on prices. And this is why we are now observing inflation. Looking at it from a slightly different angle, you could see, well, there's been also quite a large increase in loans to the private sector. Well, most of it essentially being due to loans for real estate, as in other countries. So, yeah, but looking at it from the post-Keynesian point of view, the argument usually goes the other way around. So this is not what I would argue. That another cause which has been proposed is the large support programs that were put in place by several governments in Canada in particular in the spring of 2020. So there were huge deficits. In the US, they had stimulus programs mostly later in 2021. And as a consequence of that, as we shall see, households have accumulated a large amount of financial assets, part of them in the form of money balances. And some people are arguing, well, that's the cause of inflation. There's a kind of excess demand due to this consumption driven by past accumulation of financial assets. Here is the budget balance of the Canadian governments, province and federal. So you can see 15%. The budget deficit was 15% of GDP, still around 5% last year. So people would say, well, that's the cause. One intriguing factor is if you look at this table, you can see, okay, this is 2020 Q1, and then there was this big fall in the Q2, where you can see that employee compensation went down by about $100 billion, but disposable income went up instead of going down. And this was because of the bigger transfers that were provided by the government. And so final consumption, you can see that there was a huge drop at the beginning of the COVID. And this led to a huge increase in savings. And still today, if you look here at the personal saving rate of Canadians, you can see there were, well, the saving rate is usually around 2 or 3%, has been for a long time. Then it suddenly jumped to 25% and still around, as I said, around 5% today and remain around 10% for some quarters. So again, well, one could say that this could be the cause of inflation. In the US, you have a something similar happen. You have this big increase in disposable personal income due to the Biden support programs. And with respect to consumption, again, you have some people saying, well, consumption is the cause of excess demand because it is above trend for the late, since the middle of 2021. Another belief, some people believe wage growth has been the culprit. And usually one could argue that wage growth is overly fast wage growth is the main culprit. But on the other side, usually post-Keynesians consider that wages are only trying to catch up, so they are not the initial cause of inflation. In addition, we know that the bargaining power of workers has gone down since the Thatcher-Reagan neoliberal years in the 1980s. However, again, one can find some data that would support that wages are the cause of inflation. You can see, this is the Canadian data, but you can see this big increase suddenly in the rate of growth of wages in 2020. But the cause of this, as I explained in the next slide, is solely the result of a composition effect. So what happened is that because of COVID, activity stopped in sectors where wages were low, like in restaurants, hotel, retail services. So a lot of direct workers were laid off. The white-collar workers stayed on with their higher wage rates. And in addition, those direct workers that were kept on the job had to work supplementary hours. They received overtime payments, and all this led to this big increase in the rate of growth of wages. And since then, as we can see here, in red, we have the rate of growth of wages, and in black, we have the rate of growth of prices in 2022 over the different months. And you can see, indeed, wages are not even keeping up with the rate of growth of prices. So wages are not the cause of inflation. Expectations, I don't have anything for Canada, but in the US, you can see that expectations are, well, as is said here, well behaved in the sense that they stay around 2% for medium-term expectations of inflation. This is 5-year forward inflation expectation. All right, so now we come to the real causes. So here you have various measures of supply chain bottlenecks. And you can see, yes, indeed, in 2020, 2021, even beginning of 2022, those bottlenecks were getting harder and harder, but they have been improving over the last few quarters. And if you look at transportation cost, again, you can see this huge increase. It used to be pretty flat, and then there is a big increase in transportation cost in 2021 and the beginning of 2022. And right now, it seems to be have we're back to where we were. So yes, we can certainly say that these outside causes are certainly the main culprit for the inflation, especially that this is something which is common to all countries, as we have seen before. And this is reflected in the fact that the GDP deflator for the business sector has increased before the consumer price index. And so one could say, well, for a while, the business sector incorporated those price increases without repercuting them to the consumer sector. And so in a sense, what happened in 2021 is now being reflected in 2022 and currently. Okay, I really want to do is focus on the case of profit inflation, because this is what has been most talked about among heterodox authors. So several economists, mostly left-wing economists or heterodox economists, but not only, are convinced that besides the initial supply chain issue, which started the process, increases in profit margins by businesses would be the key culprit of this high inflation, or relatively high, this 6% or 7% inflation that we have now at for consumer prices. So I give a list of several authors here who have mentioned this. But one study that started this view, and which is almost always cited by the various authors claiming that profit inflation now is something big, is the one by Josh Bivens for the Economic Policy Institute. So this was the figure that was in his study, where he showed that, well, in light blue, you have what occurred in the past, and in dark blue, you have what has occurred recently, 2020, 2021. And so the argument was, yeah, in the past, you could mostly blame unit labor cost for the inflation, but now it would be all because of corporate profits. So that's the argument which is put forward. And other authors have some different measure of this, but it all comes down to something similar. And here we have the situation for Canada. What's interesting is that you can see that the rise in inflation for the corporate sector is due to things which are not related to profits, whereas as the economy gets better, it's to a large extent, it's linked to profit income rising. Okay, now, what I think is important is that one has to distinguish between profits, profit margins, and what people like myself or Frederick Lee used to call costing margin. So first, when the economy comes out of a recession, it is normal for profits to increase along with output. So this can easily explain why profits have gone up since 2021 as the economy picked up. So the question is whether profits rise as a normal phenomenon, as I've just said, or whether firms have increased their percentage markup. So when we're talking about profit inflation, what at least we should have in mind is an increase in percentage markup. So the new studies look at ratios, and what they look mostly at is the price to unit labor cost ratio. So ULC for unit labor cost. And this ratio is said to be an estimate of profit margins. But the profit margin is not the same thing as the costing margin or the percentage markup that firms use to set prices. So when we're talking about the markup, we should be thinking about the percentage costing margin. So the profit view of inflation, if we look at it in a very simple way, we can say the price is equal to 1 plus M, where M is the percentage markup times the unit labor cost. So then the rate of price inflation, if we put this in growth terms, is equal to the rate of growth of this measure of the markup plus the difference between the rates of growth of wages and labor productivity. Okay, so the issue is there a rise in M? I mean, is M rising or not? So there's two problems with this measure of price over unit labor cost as a measure of profit inflation. The first problem is that because of the presence of overhead labor cost, ULC, the unit labor cost, varies endogenously with the level of output and the rate of capacity utilization. So all other things being equal, the unit cost will fall with a rise in the rate of utilization. Let me close this. So, and hence the profit share will rise with the while the wage share will go down, giving the illusion that the markup has risen. So that's the first problem linked to overhead labor costs. And then there is a second problem in the sense that labor costs are not the only costs faced by firms. Firms also face material costs. So the cost of intermediate goods and the cost of imported materials. So we may say that unit costs are in fact equal to the unit labor cost plus the unit material cost. And if the unit material cost is rising faster than the unit labor cost, an increase in the ratio, which is usually calculated price over unit labor cost, will also give the illusion that the markup has risen. So, whoops. So graphically, how does it look like? Here I have the way that post-Keynesians look at pricing and unit cost in a standard firm. So the idea is that unit direct costs are constant. So if you want, the marginal cost is constant up to full capacity. But most firms operate in the flat region rather than in the rising portion of unit direct cost. And so what this means is that there is a continuous fall in the unit cost as there is an increase in output or in sales. So, okay, so then I can move to the next slide, which shows that with a given markup, profits will be much bigger. So the big rectangle corresponds to the amount of profits in a situation where the level of output is high, and the area, the small rectangle, corresponds to the profits, the overall profits, when the economy is not doing well, is producing a little output. So because of the way that, because of the structure of these unit cost or unit direct cost and the way the firms set prices in an oligopolistic market, you will also always observe an increase in profits and in the share of profits, even if the markup is constant, when in the short run, when there is an increase in economic activity. And indeed, this is what happened. I mean, during the COVID, especially in quarter 2 of 2022, but also of 2020, sorry. So in 2020, we had this big decrease in the level of output in Canada, but in other countries, the same. And then it picked up. Then we were back on trend. And if we look at the rate of capacity utilization, you can observe again the same thing with the rate of capacity utilization in Canada. So the funny thing, well, funny, it's not that funny, but in the second quarter of 2020, the labor share jumped from 55% to 64%. Why? Because there was this decrease in production, which led to a big decrease in the total amount of profits and therefore in the total amount of the profit share. So the profit share jumped from this level, which had been around 54% over the last 10 years, and then jumped to 64%. Now, just one note in passing, Marxists would say, looking at this graph, they would say that production fell because there was a profit squeeze. They would say, oh, there was a big increase in the wage share, and therefore producers refused to produce anymore. And that because of the profit squeeze, then there was a fall in economic activity. But, you know, the causality has to be read the other way around, obviously, in this case. So here we have a graph showing what happens through the business cycle. So when things are going well, the actual unit cost is going down. Is going down because of the presence of all these overhead costs, in particular overhead labor costs. And so despite the fact that the net costing margin, or if you want, the markup, remains the same, the actual profit margin, which is the distance between the actual unit cost and the price, will be much bigger than when we are at the bottom of the business cycle, where the actual unit cost will move up, again, because of overhead costs, despite the fact that the net costing margin remains the same. So to me, this is clearly what has happened. So that's the first issue, the first problem. Then there is the second problem linked to the existence of imported raw materials and intermediate goods. And when this is the case, when we have unit material cost, then the price equation will be equal to 1 plus m, so little m being the percentage markup. But this will now be multiplied by the sum of the unit labor cost and the unit material cost. So, and then we can rewrite this as 1 plus m times 1 plus j, where j is equal to the ratio between the unit material cost and the unit labor cost. So if unit material costs are rising faster than unit labor costs, well, this will have an impact on the rate of inflation. The rate of inflation will be higher for a given increase in wages relative to productivity. And in my opinion, this is exactly what has happened during the COVID. So we may say from these simple pricing equations that there are three possible sources of inflation. One is a rate of increase in nominal wages, which was faster than labor productivity. And so the answer to this is no, this was not the case. An increase in the profit margins of firms. So that would be either tied to the monopoly position of some firms or as a response to a strong aggregate demand. So that is the question. That's where the controversy is. Or it could be caused by a rate of increase in the unit cost of imported material inputs, which was faster than that of labor income. And this eventually is passed on to consumers. And yes, one could say that, well, this was the initial cause of this increase in rates of inflation throughout Europe and in North America. So, yeah, one thing that we should say is that if the unit material cost rises faster than unit labor cost, this will lead to a rise in the profit share. And it will lead to a fall in the real wage of workers, because then from the previous equations, the real wage will be equal to labor productivity divided by 1 plus M, so 1 plus the markup, and 1 plus J, which is this ratio of material cost, unit material cost to unit labor cost. And of course, what central banks are fearing is that this fall in real wages, which is being observed, is likely to induce workers and trade unions to look for a catch-up during future wage bargaining. And are there any solutions to, okay, let me come back to this measurement problem, which is how good is this measure of the markup when you use the price over the unit labor cost? So we have those two problems. The first one related to the presence of unit material cost. And then we have to find an estimate of normal unit cost, or at least normal unit labor cost, so as to help compute an appropriate ratio and hence find a true percentage markup. So people are aware of this problem, or at least some people are aware of this problem. And so there are two suggestions which have been provided to get an estimate of the normal unit labor cost. So either you use labor productivity, because we know that labor productivity goes up with a higher level of output, or you take into account rates of capacity utilization. So all else equal, a recession is associated with a lower productivity. Again, because of the presence of overhead labor cost. But what happens is that if you use, it's good to use this correction by using labor productivity in general, but in the case of COVID, it doesn't work out. Doesn't work out at all. So in general, yes, if there is a decrease in the rate of utilization, there should be a decrease in labor productivity. But what we observed during the COVID, here I have data for the United States, is that there was an increase in labor productivity. The rate of growth of labor productivity used to be around 1 or 2%, and then it jumped to 5 or 6% in 2020, 2021. So, and then as the economy gets better, labor productivity goes negative. Labor productivity growth becomes negative. So labor productivity is not a good proxy to get a proper assessment of normal unit labor cost. And it's the same in Canada. You can see that labor productivity drastically rises during the second quarter of 2020. It's still high in the third quarter of 2020. And then since then, labor productivity has gone down. So growth of labor productivity has been negative over the last few quarters. So you cannot make a correction with labor productivity. You could perhaps do it with labor utilization. Okay, so I come to my conclusion, but I need 5 slides to conclude. So how do we solve current inflation? Reduce the money supply. Well, if you are a post-Keynesian, you don't believe in this causality going from the money supply to prices. Reduce government spending. Well, again, it seems, I mean, in Canada, but I'm sure in all the other countries, there is a lot to be done for education, transport, etc. So that wouldn't be a good idea either. Raise the value-added taxes. Well, we know that, at least in the short run, it would cause inflation to be even higher. Raise income taxes. Well, that's not very popular among governments right now. Tax excess corporate profits, for instance, those of the oil and gas industries. Well, a few countries have done that. So yes, that could be something that can be done. Do nothing. Well, a few people are indeed saying that the rate of inflation will go down by itself as all these transportation problems, supply chains problems go away. So yeah, so that might be a possibility. Implement wage and price controls. Well, we had wage and price controls in Canada in the 1970s, and there have been studies showing that it has been effective in decreasing the rate of inflation without creating more unemployment. So that's a possibility, but of course, it's complicated to put in place, at least in the very short run. And so the last solution is raise interest rates, which is what has been done in most countries. Now, a lot of my post-Keynesian colleagues argue that this should not be done. But, you know, when you look at short-term rate of interest, at least in Canada, but I'm sure it was the same in Europe, you can see that we have had real interest rates which have been negative for a long time. Well, at least since 2020. Is that a normal situation? So I think there is an argument for having raised interest rates because they were just too low before. But several of my heterodox colleagues argued that the problem with inflation now is the supply chains. So they say raising interest rates will not solve the problem. It will just reduce the capacity to be able to respond to the new demand. So yeah, this looks certainly like a correct statement. We have a supply side problem. So interest rates then would be reducing the supply. So that wouldn't be a good way to solve the problem. But this to me seems to be a weak argument. The bottlenecks now, as we have seen in previous slides, are much smaller than before. Interest rates, that's my argument, have been overly low for too long. They have led to financial asset inflation. They have led to real estate inflation. And a number of us have argued that, well, at what level should the rate of interest be in an economy? And Bazinetti has argued about a just, he speaks about a just rate. Initially, he called it the natural rate, but the proper word is the just rate. And a just rate or a fair rate of interest is one where the nominal rate of interest is equal to the growth rate of wages. So how was this realized in the past? So here again, we have data for Canada. And well, we can see, so this is the difference between the nominal interest rate minus the nominal wage growth, rate of growth of wages. So if the interest rate was fair or just, we would be on the zero line. So you can see that with neoliberalism as it arose with Thatcher and Reagan, and as it has its impact in Canada as well, you can see that, well, yeah, interest rates were much too high in the 1980s and 1990s. It's only around 2000 that we got back to interest rates that one could say they were just or nearly just. But what you can see is that since 2010, we are on the negative side. The nominal interest rate has been too low compared to wage growth. So that would be my argument. Now, yeah. So what's the impact? So that's my last slide. What's the impact of interest rates of inflation? Many heterodox economists object that raising interest rates will destroy productive capacity. But the same heterodox economists, I mean, my friends, used to argue that interest rates have no or little effect on business investment. So there's a contradiction here. Higher or slightly lower interest rates are not going to have much of an impact on corporate investment. What higher interest rates do is that they can decrease domestic aggregate demand, mainly through residential investment. So the main impact of higher interest rates is on the construction industry. Okay, so it will have an impact, and it has an impact already in the US and in Canada. Now, the whole problem with monetary policy is that we know that the Phillips curve has a long, flat segment. So monetary policy will manage to lower inflation in the domestic economy only if there is a very large increase in the rate of unemployment. Because if there is only a small increase in the rate of unemployment, there will be no change in the rate of inflation. So this is the dilemma with of using interest rates for central bankers. I mean, there is no easy solution. The only way out I can see is that if all central banks do alike, so meaning most central banks raise interest rates, at least in Western economies, then there will be a world slowdown and the prices of raw materials will go down. And it is this that will have a strong impact on inflation without necessarily having a large impact in domestic unemployment. So in other words, my view of how inflation is being driven in our world where central banks are claiming that they are targeting inflation, my view is that, well, no, not really. They're not that successful in targeting the inflation rate. What drives up and down inflation rates in countries such as Canada, the US, European countries, which have a low inflation regime, is the evolution of raw materials and the evolution of oil and gas, the prices of oil and gas. So yeah, one has just to hope that in the future, the prices of these raw materials will not keep on rising, and that will allow us to come back to a reasonable rate of inflation, well, reasonable by North American standards, without a large increase in domestic unemployment. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, I
Well,
had a that's
excuse me.
that's my latest book, second edition.
Oh, this one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, one more book to buy, and then it's 8:50 now. We are proceeding as planned. So we have about half an hour for discussions. And how should we proceed, yeah, Mark? One question at a time, or some questions and answers?
Well, we'll see. If the questions are complicated, then perhaps one at a time, or otherwise, yeah, I can take some notes.
I personally prefer one question at a time myself. So let's do it that way. Any questions?
Good. Okay.
Oh, if you turn
Well,
off the.
stop sharing.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, well, this rule, the fair rate of interest or just rate of interest, where the rate of interest should be equal to the rate of growth of nominal. So the nominal rate of interest should be equal to the nominal rate of growth of wages. This only tells us that people who borrow funds or people who lend funds are getting are paying the right price to borrow, or looking at it the other way from the rentier point of view, they are getting a fair return on their money, in the sense that they are able to I mean, they are lending the equivalent, if you want, of 1 hour of labor, and then when they will get back their money, when they will be reimbursed, they will get again the equivalent of 1 hour of labor. So it's in that sense that it's a fair rate of interest, but it has nothing to do, at least directly, with whether the wage share will go down or will go up, because this is linked to well, markups, or to this is linked to, yeah, the distribution, the income distribution between profits and wages. So you might very well have a just rate of interest, but on the other hand, it could well be that the wage share is going down, or it could be that the wage share is going up. So it's not related. I mean, this fair rate of interest is basically a fair rate for lenders and borrowers. That's its purpose. Not really. I mean, unless you believe there would be a relationship if one thought, like some Sraffians, that there is a tight relationship between the say long-term rate of interest and the long-term rate of profit. If you believe that there is a fairly stable relationship between the long-term rate of interest and the long-term rate of profit, then yes, it would have some impact on the wage share.
Okay, if you are done with your question, okay, Eric wants to ask a question, so please go ahead, Eric.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, Marc.
Hello, Eric.
Just got into New York for the Easterns. So here's my question. As always, very clear, very compelling. I am going to have to catch up on my Pazinetti, but my question is this. So something that's being discussed here is basically a change in the effectiveness of labor demanding increases in wages, especially at lower incomes. So more unionization, less willingness to come back and work in low-paying, high-risk jobs. So if there is a change in that behavior, can that lead to a difference in the inflation rate due to a change in basically the assumptions that have been built in? Just curious.
Well, basically what you are referring to is a conflicting claims theory of inflation. And so what you are saying is that, the parameters that are relevant to the wage inflation curve, so to speak, are becoming higher or tougher. And so in theory, in those models, this could lead to an increase in the rate of inflation. But at the same time, it could also lead to an increase in the wage share.
Got it. Yep. Okay. Right. Doesn't have to be passed through. I understand. Okay. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the argument of Kaliskians, that indeed, if the workers are more ask for more, are more active, then they could have an impact, a favorable impact on the wage share. And that the reason for which inflation rates have been so low during all those years, again, all else being equal, was because of this Thatcher-Reagan years where the unions were killed off, so to speak.
So,
thanks very much.
Their bargaining power went down, I guess.
Exactly.
Any other questions?
I have a question, actually.
Go ahead, David.
My question is, so the current policy rate at Canada, Bank of Canada, is, I think, 4.5%. And your consumer inflation is around 6, slightly close to 7%. And producer inflation is still about that, I think near 10%. So what would your just rate imply about the rate right now, like in February 2020? What would your policy advice to Canada, the Bank of Canada, be? That's my first question. What about the other alternatives you mentioned? Like, what about mixing the policy with controls, price control, and excess profit taxation, and at the same time some tightening by the Bank of Canada? Wouldn't that be more successful given the volume of interventions? Thanks.
Let me ask you, what do you mean by monetary tightening by the bank.
Just the rate, the policy rate.
So
Okay.
you're assuming that the only policy tool that the Bank of Canada uses is the policy rate.
Yeah, it was a matter of speech, actually. I'm talking about the rate right now.
Okay. Well, as I said, I think one can be in favor of a special tax on excess profits in oil and gas industries, because certainly they have taken advantage just because in those markets prices are set by the supply and demand, so it's not based on a markup. So yeah, I would be in favor of that. What is the just rate right now in Canada? Well, certainly it had to be higher than what it was in 2020 or 2021, or even at the end, still at the end of 2022. It was still near zero. And to me, it made no sense. I mean, I have been saying for a long time that, and even before, that, I mean, it's not normal that you should keep interest rates so low. Usually the neoclassical economists argue that there's been an increase in the saving rate, that there's been a fall in the productivity growth. That's their arguments. But we know that, no, it's not true. There has not been an increase in the saving rate. So all these arguments based on the natural rate of interest and loanable funds theory don't stand up. And so one could argue that the reason for which interest rates were low over the last few years is because aggregate demand has been weak. And one of the reasons it may have been weak is because the wage share has been so low. Real wages have not grown fast enough. So I would certainly say that interest rates had to rise. Even if we had not had inflation, I would have argued that the Bank of Canada and the Fed should have raised interest rates, because, I mean, having very low rates of interest only favors stock market speculation and real estate speculation. I mean, the low rates of interest have not benefited the poor as such. They have benefited mostly the rich. So that is why I'm in favor of this just rate. Now, if you consider that the rate of growth of wages is around 3 or 4% now, well, the interest rate should be around 3 or 4%. Now, the difficult question is, what rate of interest are we talking about? And that's the other difficult issue. Are we talking about the rate of interest set by the central bank? Or are we talking about a 1-year rate of interest? Or are we talking about the long-term 10-year rate of interest? So that's the difficulty in judging what is this just rate of interest. But one thing for sure, interest rates were too low over the last year. So it's normal that they are now higher. Should they keep raising them? No, I think that's enough. We shouldn't have these cycles of interest rates going very, very low and then going very, very high. It's absurd. I mean, people, in the businesses, everybody needs some kind of certainty. So if we know that interest rates are slowly moving around this just rate, at least, things are not going to change all the time. Okay, price controls. Well, as I said, I've always been in favor of some sort of price controls, but I realize it's not always easy. So yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on this. I know that Galbraith was very much, John Kenneth Galbraith was very much in favor of them. I don't know if it would work in a country like Turkey. As I said, in Canada, they had some positive influence in reducing inflation rates. The problem is, if you have price control, you also have wage control. In Canada, when we had these, we had wage, dividend, and price controls. But what happens is that nobody is happy. The businesses are not happy. The trade unions are not happy because they say they can't negotiate their wages anymore. This is an attack against unions. So it's difficult to implement wage and price controls and dividend controls.
Yeah, essentially for political reasons, I guess. There are two questions, one by Gal and the other is by Ilhan. But before I let them ask their questions, I have a question. Bank of Canada. Canada suffers from, I guess, high inflation in real estate more than the US, as far as I know. But both in the US and Canada, both the stock markets are and the real estate markets are highly priced. If the central banks of these countries continue raising the interest rates, the policy rates, so to speak, wouldn't it create some sort of collapse maybe in the prices of equities, stock markets, and real estate markets? I mean, that might have a negative influence on the real economy as well as the well-being of the working class, if you like.
Well, I think we shouldn't worry too much about the stock market, because people who have put their money in the stock market have benefited from it, at least for quite a while. The concern is more about the real estate, because, you know, maybe 60% of the people own a house, and you know, everybody would like to have an apartment or a house at a reasonable price. So I think what you just said is one reason for which the Bank of Canada and the Fed have kept rates of interest very low, is that they want to avoid a collapse of the real estate market, as occurred in the US in 2006, 2007. So that's why they hesitated, I think, to raise interest rates in 2022. And of course, the situation now for new buyers is the worst of all, because they are now facing high prices in real estate, and now they have to pay a higher rate of interest than before. So, yeah, for newcomers, it's a very bad situation.
Yeah, at this level of prices, it's very difficult for newcomers to buy new houses. But there are so many. So anyway, maybe we can discuss this later. Who was the first person who raised
Gal, you mentioned.
And Gal?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the presentation. I think I have two questions, maybe one. First, you concluded by saying, discussing possible solutions to inflation. My question is, in your view, is it important to solve inflation? Did inflation get to a level in which it's dangerous? Or maybe there are other core problems or more important problems? I think that's my, I'll keep it at that for now. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, myself and lots of our colleagues wonder why we should focus so much on 2%. Why not 3%, 4%? I mean, we had very successful years in the 50s or the 60s where the rate of inflation was above 2%. And in fact, people like Kaldor argued that having a rate of inflation which was, much different from zero is in fact a good thing. And my colleague Mario Secareccia and myself, we have written a lot showing that at least the Bank of Canada has never shown in any way that a lower rate of inflation would lead to a higher rate of growth of productivity, because that's their argument. The argument is having a low rate of inflation is the best that a central bank can do. But no, one can argue there are lots of things a central bank can do, like make sure that there is no financial instability. Certainly is also something that the central bank or other regulatory organizations should be worried about. So, I agree with you. And that's why some people have said, well, why try to bring it down to 2%? Why not leave it at 4%?
Great, thank you. I have another question, if that's okay. Regarding the oil prices, you said they are determined by supply and demand, but actually they started rising before Russia invaded Ukraine. And what I'm trying to ask is, why was there a problem in supply? So maybe it was speculative. So why couldn't oil supply meet demand? That's my question.
Well, I'm not an expert on oil, so I won't answer your question. Sorry, I might say something stupid. So I'll stick to what I know.
Okay, there are two other people who want to ask questions. I don't know which one wanted to ask the question first, so
I think Ilan was.
okay, I'll give it to Ilhan, and then Ismail is going to ask his question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me properly. Hi, Mark. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I would like to say my position about the fair rate of interest. I think it depends on the distribution of wealth or income. If its inequality is too high, I am for fixing the nominal interest at zero, as Kansas City rule proposed, because top rich people or top high income earners, they do not spend out of their savings in order to consume. They have already high enough money, and we do not have to provide them a positive real interest income. If the level of inequality is too low and income is equitable distributed, then I am for a passionate rule, let's say. I think such a distinction we need to do. Secondly, regarding your argument that raising interest rates is a big argument, you said, against inflation. But if we compare the countries, for example, in US, inflation went down, in Brazil went down, and in these countries, production has increased. But in Argentina and in Israel, despite the rate hikes, inflation didn't go down because production hasn't increased enough. That's why I think solutions in order to overcome these production problems that are much more decisive to tackle inflation. That's why still I think raising interest rate is not a solution, and the argument is not weak, I would say. Thank you.
Yeah, well, again, the title of the presentation is Inflation in North America. So I'm rather hesitant to talk about what advice one could give to a country like Argentina or Turkey. I would rather leave this to economists who are living in those countries and that have a better idea than I do of what are the problems in these countries, and not only inflation problems. I mean, I know a little bit about Brazil, and I mean, certainly in Brazil, they do not have a just rate of interest. I mean, the rate of interest in Brazil, when the rate of inflation is around 10%, is often around 20 or 22%. So it's their situation is completely different from those of countries in North America. About your suggestion for what interest rate we should have when there is a lot of inequality in wealth distribution. Again, I'm reluctant to go for a zero rate of interest because it produces speculation, stock market inflation, real estate inflation. I don't think that's the way to go.
Sorry, Roshan proposes. Louis-Philippe says it is because of lack of regulations. If we fix enough regulations, we can overcome these asset bubbles, despite we have still lower rate of interests.
Well, I mean, he's right. I mean, regulations you can make it very tough to borrow funds to purchase apartments or houses. You can have very strict regulations, like you must have 20 or 30% as a down payment of your own money before you can borrow. It is true, but still, I feel uncomfortable with a zero rate of interest.
Okay, thank you. I think it's Ismail now who is going to ask the question. You need to turn on your microphone, Ismail. Your microphone is still off. We don't hear him. Oh.
Okay.
He wrote to you? Okay. Okay, go ahead.
That's a very good question, and that's why I'm kind of hesitant about wage and price control. So I'm not saying that I want to implement it in the current circumstances. I'm just saying that this is one of the solutions which has been proposed. It's not a stupid solution, as some people think. You know, many neoclassical economists would say it's a stupid solution. I think it's a solution that is worth to consider. But as Ismail has suggested, it's not easy to implement. I think I've said it also before, that even the trade unions would or might object to a wage and price control system, even if also dividends would be there's never any easy solution. I mean, some people say, oh, just do this, do that, and everything will be solved. But that's not how it works in real life. I mean, it's the same with your kids or whatever.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Any other questions, friends? Oktay, anyone from YouTube who wants to ask a question, and have you looked at it?
Well, maybe just one thing that I want to talk. Hi, Mark. It's nice to
Yes.
virtually see you after a long time. Well, it's not a question that I'm going to ask, but I'm inspired by the presentation that you have, which is very clear for me that we are talking about the supply disruption following COVID-19 and then the war in Ukraine, which is very clear. It's an energy shock and the prices are increasing, and then we are calling them this is the driver of the global inflation. But at the same time, the importance of this profit of the corporation, it's a very, very important, which was very clear in the presentation. But something that also made me think about monetarism, where they talk about money supply and the government spending, that they increase the quantity of money and this leads to the inflation. I think there is something that we can add also here, because here the composition of this balance sheet of the federal government and the government spending is not direct spending of the government that goes to the households or the low income groups. Here, basically, that they do this kind of spending, increasing amount of money in order to ease the stress in the financial system, which is an important role of here, the treasury bills, government bonds, to be used as a collateral in the government system, which has nothing to do with the government expenditures. I think that's also something important that we can add.
Yes, that's a good point. In one of the slides, it was clear that the government issued a lot of bonds. They issued a higher amount of bonds than was the government deficit. And so a large chunk of these bonds ended up in a way as deposits of the government at the central bank. So yes, you're quite right. There is also this issue with the fact that these government bonds or treasury bills are being used as collateral in the financial system. And this makes everything a bit more complicated.
Yeah, some of those issuances of treasury bonds, at least in the US, as far as I know, to solve some liquidity problems in the credit and the money markets, essentially, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's one could argue that the interest rates were brought down to zero, not only because they wanted to help the real economy, but also because the central bank wanted to help the financial system.
Yeah, the way they implement the quantitative easing programs is essentially pumping the money into the financial sector rather than the real sector, right? They purchase all these bonds from non-bank financial corporations, which then use that money for non-productive purposes, or send them to outside to countries like ours, which doesn't increase in any way aggregate demand, I guess, right? Because if it doesn't end up in the hands of the households, how are they going to increase their spending? Indeed, probably until 2020, the reason why we haven't observed much inflation in the US is that all those monetary expansions through QEs did not go to the households and couldn't increase their spending power. Anyway,
Yeah, I think it's important to say that quantitative easing, its main impact is to lower long-term rates of interest. Or if when they do quantitative easing by buying corporate bonds or other sorts of private bonds, it's to lower the spread between the safe government bonds and the not so safe corporate bonds.
yeah, I
That's
wouldn't. Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, but that's the purpose. I would say the real purpose of quantitative easing.
Not so much the treasury interest rates, long-term treasury interest rates, but the spread between the long-term rates and the corresponding maturity riskier, that I would say, right? That's spreads went down. Indeed, went
Yes.
down to zero nearly, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, it's about 9:30 now. We took more time than we asked from Mark. Is there any other question, or am I allowed to ask this question to the audience if there is another question? And if there is none, maybe let me see the rest of the screen, because I don't see all of the participants. No, apparently there is no one who wants to ask a question. I guess it's time to thank Mark for this wonderful presentation and discussion, and the time he shared with us. And hopefully we will see you again in future webinars. And Oktay warned me that I should also announce before we finish this webinar that the next week, I don't know how to pronounce his name. You're a French speaker, maybe you can.
Louis-Philippe Rochon.
Very difficult for Louis-Philippe Rochon.
Louis-Philippe Rochon.
Okay, Louis-Philippe. He's going to talk, and indeed Louis-Philippe and Marc are quite close, and they work together as far as I know, right?
Well, it turns out that Louis-Philippe, not only he was an undergraduate student at the University of Ottawa, but he also comes from the same small city as I do.
Yeah, so you know each other quite well and work together.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mark.
So thank you for giving me the opportunity.